Alright, hey everybody, this is Josiah. Today I'm going to be talking about how I made the machine, which is my nightmare robot version of Azrael. This is, I guess, my third nightmare design that I've done in Photoshop, and I felt like just kind of walking through the layers and how I constructed this guy. So we're going to start from the basics. I started with a masterfully crafted sketch of what I wanted the final product to look like. Truly beautiful. And because this was a headshot, I wanted to focus mostly on his face, and because it's a nightmare character, I wanted to do a lot of very intense lighting and perspective that made him look very intimidating. So I started with just drawing the basic mass of his face. This is the plate that goes over the outside. I used a very grungy brush shape and grungy eraser to really, kind of make the outside edges really jagged and kind of frightening. And I used some burns to darken it a little bit, and I dodged a lot to kind of bring the shape out to make it appear more rounded. And I used a weird brush to add some interesting texture to the way that it dodged. After that, I added another layer behind it that's equally grungy, to just kind of give the metal some thickness and make it feel very heavy. After that, I'm going to turn the sketch layer off for now and just use the gray wash so things are easier to see. After this, I added some structure to the face. So you can see here, I have these two little arches that are nice and shaded, that look like just structural things that would have held the face together. I added some loose wiring to start getting the mechanical effect going, including a severed wire down here, which I used a custom sparks brush to decorate. And from there, I had to start building the mass of his mouth. His mouth wound up being a very kind of complicated ordeal. So I started with, in Nightmare Designs, I focus a lot on the eyes and mouth of whatever monster character I'm creating, because they're the most identifiable and the most potentially intimidating features of the face. So my idea for the mouth was I wanted to throw in a lot of kind of sharp objects and gnarly things that look like things you wouldn't want to touch. So I started basically by just filling out the shape of the head with this circuit panel, and I started just kind of like adding gears to produce the shape of what would become the jaw. So this doesn't really reflect the order in which I did them, but I added gears, I added saw blades, and I added hydraulics to emulate kind of the way that the jaw would open mechanically. I kind of interspersed them in a lot of interesting ways to make them look like they're going all different directions, and like to fill out the shape of the mouth so it looks like the mouth is really like just full of all these very intimidating sorts of structures. After that, I wanted to kind of augment the realism of all these things and develop what would be the really core facial features. So I started by just adding a little bit more detail to the face. I added this scratched metal texture that I think made it feel like a really realistic piece of steel. And I started color correcting all these gears. So it was small adjustments at first, and then because they'd had this spark in the center, I wanted to bring a lot of contrast to make it look like his mouth lights up, because it's a very intimidating feature. So that's how I did that. I added some sparks. I did some hard light layers to really up the contrast and get it really scary looking. And here I started generating his eye. And my idea for his eye was I wanted it to be artificial, like a light, like some kind of a bulb, but I didn't want it to have a very specific pupil because I think that makes him look more ethereal, like something you would see in a nightmare. So I put in a similar glow on the opposite side so that his face almost lights up the same way. But I think having the one eye that stares directly at the camera is a lot more intimidating than having the two, and it works especially well with the fact that this side of his face is severed in the way that it is. I added a couple more sparks down here just to kind of dramatize that whole section. And after that, it was time to start, building the more identifiable masses of the character. So I started with the basic construction of his hood. I started with just a very simple, like, painted on layer to produce the shape. I added some shadows for dimension and to kind of like get the way that the fabric flows, and texture. I wound up using, I forget what the material's called, but it's the same kind of thing that like IKEA shopping bags are made out of, where it's supposed to be, it's supposed to be really durable and fire retardant, and it's not comfortable, but like in my mind, that's the kind of fabric that you would put on a robot if you were going to put fabric on a robot, especially one, that has a lot of sharp edges and a lot of exposed wires, because it's something that's not going to catch on fire. So it really made practical sense. From there, I added a couple more lighting effects to really make it look like the face is on the inside of this hood, and like make the lights a little more intense in the way that they show up outside of it. After that, I wasn't sure how to approach building the body at first, so I started with my idea of just building his forearm. So I got a robotic forearm here. It actually wound up being a left hand, and so I had to alter it to make it a right hand. So I had to cut out where the thumb was on this side. I had to reflect all the fingers in certain ways, and I wound up pasting the thumb on the other side so it looks more like a right hand. I also basically just kind of beefed up certain sections of the arm to make it look a little more durable, a little more hardcore, which is the kind of thing that I would expect from a character like this. After that, I added this robotic heart that he's holding. I just chose a kind of a very futuristic looking power core that I thought was a very compelling shape composition. I like the lighting. I added some loose wires to that to make it a little more intense, some sparks to make it look like it was just freshly ripped out, and just some basic color adjustments on the arm to help it fit with what I knew I wanted overall out of the piece, because I knew it was going to be very lighting intensive. It was going to be very dark, and so all the parts wound up being this very black shade, but it's tilted towards blue, because I think that kind of cool color works very well with the idea that he's mechanical. So after I finished the forearm, I started building the body kind of backwards, in that I started with the arms and went in. So for his upper arm, I started with just one large hydraulic piece to get the mass of it. And this is something that has a lot of detail. It's something that makes a lot of sense for a robot. And so it would be the thing that carried the rest of the details on his back, because this is like the major mass of the arm. After that, I added just a few pieces to make it make more anatomical sense. I didn't add these ones attached to the chest until later, but I added this like kind of C-3PO attachment that would have, closed his elbow in a way that is realistic. From here, it was time to, start building up the mass of his body. So I started by just using 2 hydraulic pieces in the shapes of kind of his sternocleidomastoid, like the muscle that attaches from the front of his head down to his clavicle, because I wanted to retain a sort of organic look. From here, I added a few features to kind of like beef out his body. So these would have been like the lower parts of his neck. I used this to fill in kind of the mass of the center and give his body more, fullness. But here I really needed to start kind of adding to, the large mass of Azrael's body. Like the thing that he's known for is he wears large chest plates and he wears 2 large shoulder pads that make him look very big and intimidating up towards the top of his torso. And so I needed to start representing that. So I started adding little pieces here and there. The big thing was I added this gear, and the mass of it really kind of worked with the shape of his shoulder. It made his silhouette look more kind of true to his human form, and I liked that. However, the difference in angles here kind of bothered me, so I wound up just kind of slapping a metal plate over the top of it that like kind of emulates where his bicep would be really well and makes the whole thing feel like it makes a lot more mechanical sense. I also did these 2 hydraulics, which would be kind of like his pectoral muscles that would control, the movement of his upper arm by extending and contracting. And finally, I added 2 chest plates to really fill out the mass of his torso. Finally, I had to color correct all that to make it all fit in with the rest of it. So like I said, I was sticking to a very dark color palette here, but I still left in just a couple really subtle flavors of the blue color that I started with because, like I said, I think the cool color just was very necessary to create the kind of character idea that I wanted to achieve. From here, I was really mostly done with the figure. I wound up just adding a large mechanical ball joint to fill out the other side of his shoulder and make his body more realistic. And then I decided to add a background that would make him look a little more intimidating. So I started with this same scratched metal texture that I used on his face. I color corrected it to just wash a little bit of the blue out of there. Because it's in the background, I wanted it to be more subtle, but I still really wanted it to hold the whole piece together. And I added these 2 overlays for lighting adjustments to really bring like a central focus to his face because, that's where the light is, that's where the contrast is. And in the idea of like a monster headshot in a nightmare where like, the face is the thing that all your attention would be diverted towards. You want, like, when you look at this creature, you're seeing the center of it, the most, the fullness of its being. And so it was really important to kind of like generate a realistic focus in the way that you would see him, in the context of a nightmare. After this, it was really all just like final touch-ups and lighting adjustments. So I wound up adding a little bit after the fact to just intensify the way this heart looks. I added more sparks, I added more glow and shadows to make it look more realistic, more realistically like he's holding it, and just make that particular component of the piece a little more melodramatic. Finally, I decided to just do final shadow touch-ups. I did one large overlay where I burned a lot of the focus. I burned a lot of the outside edges to produce a lot of contrast angled toward the middle. And so it was, so that it draws the light into the center. Like I said, I also worked on lightening up these areas, like where light would be produced by the sparks, by the electricity. And I touched up a little bit of the stuff going on in his face and around his body. And finally, I added just a few extra sparks to really up the intimidation factor and the like intensity of areas like his eyes, his mouth, the heart, because those are the areas that when you're designing nightmare characters, those are the areas that are really truly they're the ones that people are drawn to. They're the ones that you're going to get most of the intimidating factor from. And so I felt like adding those extra bits really added energy to those components that made it really frightening. And finally, I just did a couple of very simple tilt shift blurs where I blurred a little bit on the sides here, a little bit on the top and bottom, to really just draw his face really hard into focus. And there we go. That was the end result after about maybe 2 hours of work, and I'm really proud of the way it turned out. I tried a couple new things here. I used some custom brushes, and I think I produced something that's a little bit outside my comfort zone, and I really like the way it turned out. I think he's very intimidating. I think he makes a lot of sense aesthetically as a robot, and really I think he's really frightening. I think he's really frightening, and I had fun making him, and I know I'll have fun using him someday, and that's really what it's all about. All right, thanks.